Hello, Canada Files viewers. This is Aiden Jonah, editor-in-chief of the Canada Files. I am hosting the next episode, the third of the Canada Files Speaker Series. This time, I am joined by Laith Marouf, a Palestine Solidarity longtime activist. He's based in Lebanon now. He's done much work on the media, on fighting racism in Canadian media for decades. Laith, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Terrific. So you've done a lot of things in your life, but I want to walk back to the university years. Can you walk me through your time in university, leading up to the blocking of Benjamin Netanyahu's planned speech at Concordia in 2001, and detail the attacks you faced from Zionists back at that time?
Well, I started getting politically involved in organizing in campus around the year 2000. That was, of course, the year that the Second Palestinian Intifada broke out, and the whole world watched live broadcast of Palestinians being slaughtered in the streets, and attacks on, the churches and the mosques in the occupied West Bank. Being myself as a Palestinian Syrian, that of course, got me involved in organizing on campus. There was already my older brother, Laith Marouf, was part of the founding of the Solidarity for Palestinian Human Rights. It's the student group that is, at the time, was only at Concordia and McGill University. And part of what we were trying to do in our activism is bring a coalition together of all the progressive groups on campus, the racialized communities, the indigenous, and through this coalition building, create a front to take over and control the student unions. So in 2001, in the spring of 2001, I was selected through this coalition to run on the slate for the executive of the Concordia Student Union. I was the first Arab to be elected as an executive of any student union in Canada. So, I also had the unfortunate timing to have this election happen a few months before September 11 in 2001. So within days of my election, the Zionist lobby in Canada, B'nai B'rith, at the time the Canadian Jewish Congress still existed, also mounted an attack on the Concordia Student Union and myself in very racist language. We ran in an open campaign calling for an end of Israeli occupation of Palestine, and the students elected us. We didn't hide. I didn't hide my political ideology, and the B'nai B'rith at the time, in their quote-unquote Jewish Tribune magazine, stated that now the Arab student leadership has infiltrated the Concordia Student Union. So having your political program open and transparent and getting elected in a landslide is infiltration if you're an Arab. And at the time, the administration of Concordia was, and still is, Zionist. The president of the university at the time, Frederick Lowy, and two of his vice presidents were, ardent Zionists. They began immediately finding ways to get rid of us. And, a week and a half before September 11, I got summarily expelled from the university through a decree of the president with no hearings, no accusations. The reason that I got expelled basically was for spray painting. Zionism is Jewish supremacy and Israel is an apartheid state, on a building that was to be demolished that week. So there was no, damage or mischief or whatever charges criminally that I could be receiving. That expulsion, of course, as I said, came around September 11. So the day of September 11, B'nai B'rith held a national press conference, live broadcasted in much of the media the night of September 11, and called me the Canadian Osama bin Laden, basically, and the Concordia Student Union, the youth wing of Al-Qaeda in Canada. These are funny things to say now, but they were not funny then. And held this agenda that we published at the time, a student agenda titled Uprising, and basically was ripping it on air, claimed that we even knew about September 11. This was a hilarious moment, or at least I laugh now. But there was an indigenous activist, revolutionary by the name of Splitting the Sky. He was involved in the Attica prison uprising in northern New York and in the Gustafson Lake standoff in 1995 in British Columbia. We had him invited to speak on September 11, and it said on the agenda, September 11, Splitting the Sky. So B'nai B'rith, not knowing who Splitting the Sky is, or that is a Mohawk name, told the media live on air that we knew about September 11 because of that. And of course, at that moment, myself specifically, could have ended up in Guantanamo Bay. There was RCMP and security, intelligence security parked outside my home, outside the office, following me everywhere. And that battle took around 9 months in court, where eventually we won because we were summarily expelled. The minimums of natural justice were being denied. So, this is basically kind of how my activism started. The Zionists at the time, by the way, on September 12, went around the campus with a petition to recall the executive of the Concordia Student Union. And they were going around the campus saying, if you don't want the Arabs and the to run the CSU, sign this recall. And, I was the only Arab. And the fact they meant by that, the president of the student union at the time, she was a lesbian woman. So you see, this is how low it gets and how easy it is to also trigger fascist behavior, and how the media in Canada and the administrations of universities do their best to protect these fascists on campus.
It would be great if you could take us through the events of the day where Netanyahu was set to speak and the consequences that came from that.
So, because we survived that 2001 attack after September 11, the Zionists were really pissed, especially that this coalition of progressive and racialized students was able to control the student union the next year, also in 2002. I wasn't on the executive, but I was on the student council at that point. And because of that, they decided to create a campaign or a event that they may, organize around. And I'm here talking about the Zionists. So at the time, the biggest media mogul in Canada was Israel Asper. He owned the Canvas Global media empire. Canvas Global at the time controlled 90-somewhat% of all daily newspapers in Canada, and also controlled the global television network. So Mr. Israel Asper went ahead and invited Netanyahu to come to Concordia. The administration of Concordia immediately recognized that this is going to bring them a lot of trouble. So they begged Israel Asper not to bring Netanyahu to Concordia. They even offered to rent on the budget of the university the most famous music hall in Montreal, the Place des Arts, to have Netanyahu speak there basically on the expenses of the university to avoid any confrontation or problems on campus. But Israel Asper threatened the University of Concordia to destroy all their funding if they don't let him bring Netanyahu. And of course, the administration of Concordia buckled down. They were already Zionists. They didn't need much pushing. And they decided to have this event on campus in the main hall, H110, in the whole building of Concordia. Now, on our side, we initially sent in a request to the Attorney General of Canada to charge Netanyahu with war crimes and crimes against humanity. And we had a team of lawyers and a bill sheet basically of all the crimes that he was accused of. And why did we send it to the Attorney General is because Canada is signatory to the Rome Convention, the War Crimes Convention, and is one of the few countries that actually integrated the Rome Convention into the criminal code of the country. So when you look at the Criminal Code of Canada, there's a section about war crimes and crimes against humanity. And unfortunately, because Canada wants to politicize this idea of war crimes and human rights, the only way somebody could be charged with war crimes or crimes against humanity in Canada is if the Attorney General issues the charge. So we sent the request for the Attorney General to charge Netanyahu. And at the time, the Attorney General of Canada, who is also the Minister of Justice, was Erwin Cutler, the scion, the grand wizard of Zionism, basically, in Canada, who is currently serving as the special rapporteur on combating, quote unquote, anti-Semitism. So, of course, Erwin Cutler refused to charge Netanyahu. So that left us with no choice but to conduct a citizen's arrest ourselves. So we posted, we printed posters with a wanted, and a picture of Netanyahu and the list of the crimes. And we told the media that we will be conducting a citizen's arrest on Netanyahu. That freaked out the media in Canada. That also freaked out the Zionists. Some of them were laughing, saying, you will not be able to do it. And they interviewed Netanyahu. Netanyahu laughed and said that he will go into the whole building whether we like it or not and deliver his speech. So we organized on that day, remember this is like less than a year from September 11th. So much of the people in our community at least thought that, this will be a dangerous moment, that our youth could be criminalized in ways that are severe. But we were all surprised at the turnout. Thousands upon thousands of students from across Montreal, many of them Arab and Muslim, if not the majority of them, came out to attempt to arrest Netanyahu. And this turnout was so large that we were able to, shut down all the entrances to the university and breach the security parameter in such way that the security forces protecting Netanyahu would refuse to let him enter the building. So that was already checkmate once we breached the security parameter and positioned ourselves close enough to all the entrances to the building that the Mossad agents would not allow Netanyahu to walk in front of all this crowd of Arab and Muslim students. The administration ordered the police to enter the campus and attempt to remove us. And that led to, of course, a huge scuffle. Police beat up people, broke ribs, broke hands of different demonstrators. And that led to a huge response from the demonstrators who beat the hell out of the police of Montreal. The police of Montreal probably received a whipping that they haven't ever received, I think, since before. I don't remember seeing the police of Montreal getting such a whipping. And at one point, the chief of police of Montreal arrived to me and begged me to disband the demonstrators. And he said that Netanyahu had canceled his event and he's back into the hotel. And so I decided, I was like, no, you know what? I will not be telling the demonstrators to disband. You will be telling the demonstrators to disband. I told the chief of police of Montreal, and I dragged a garbage bin. And I said, you will get up on the garbage bin and I'll give you my megaphone and you will announce the cancellation of Netanyahu's event and you will beg them to go home, which he did. And he got caught on camera doing that by the mainstream media. And of course, B'nai B'rith and the Canadian Jewish Congress and other organizations called for the firing of the chief of Montreal police for this act. Now, kind of this is kind of a brief of it. But remember, my expulsion in 2001 was summary expulsion, and the courts ruled that a university, if it claims that it's independent and wants to have its own legal issues dealt with internally, then it has to have a mechanism and a policy and laws that people can read and understand and defend themselves against. So come the event of Netanyahu 2002 and the shutdown of Netanyahu, the administration realized that it can't expel any of the demonstrators that it wanted to. All the other Palestinian and Arab and Muslim students that it wanted to target, they couldn't do it because of their loss in court just 6 months earlier. So because of this original legal battle in 2001, the students that were part of the demonstration were not expelled because the university didn't even have yet mechanisms to put in. And they created mechanisms since then that allow the university to basically expel anybody at any time they want to. And those laws haven't been challenged since 2002, by the way.
All right, so I want to ask next is around something I noticed when I was watching an interview that you did with Yuri Smuter, in fact. That was that in 2003, the protests against the Iraq War. You mentioned playing a role in this organizing. What was the extent of the role you played?
It was a very extensive role. I was in the organizing committee, both within the Arab and Muslim communities and with the larger coalition that included the unions and all the other organizations that were interested in the work. And so I would say that if it wasn't for my involvement and the involvement of a few other members of SPHR, that demonstration in 2003, the anti-war demo that came out in Montreal, the largest demo in the history of Canada up until 2012, 350,000 somewhat people came out on the streets. This demonstration wouldn't happen because there was so many misconceptions that are there within the labor movement and the left in general in Quebec. And also there is latent racism within those circles that if it wasn't for organizers like myself and others in SPHR that kind of straddle the two worlds of left and Arab or left and Muslim, there wouldn't have been a coalition that came out. At one point, I remember we were sitting in a meeting with all the large unions in Quebec, FTQ, CSN, and others. And without naming anybody, one of the presidents of the unions was arguing that no Muslim should be standing on the stage giving speeches at that demonstration. Can you imagine a demonstration against the invasion of Iraq and no Muslim or Arab speakers get to speak about it? I mean, this is how, problematic a lot of times some of the left is in Canada and other Western countries. So we had to play a balancing act. On the one hand, make the Muslim communities feel safe, that they can come out, as the war is being, a roll-up happening to the war, as they are living the hell of September 11 and all the profiling and so forth. The 2002 demonstration against Netanyahu gave vigor to the Arab and Muslim community, especially the youth, not to be scared, because we didn't get any consequences for our assertion of our rights in 2002. So that grew within the Arab and Muslim community by 2003. And at the same time, our relationships with the left and the labor movement in Quebec had matured by that point, that we can weigh in and pressure the labor movements to actually understand what solidarity means and to stop being selfish or think about stopping the invasion of Iraq from their point of view, not understanding that the Arab and Muslim communities that are in Canada are the ones that should set the tone of this demonstration. It was a big success, but the Zionists were really angry about it. Jonathan, what's his name? Barbara Emil's son, Jonathan Kay. He was his beginning of his career, and his daddy basically and global television paid him to make a documentary about the demonstration against the war in Iraq, and started basically with the Netanyahu stuff. In this documentary, Jonathan Kay and global television called all the labor unions in Quebec and the anti-war movement as anti-Jewish and pro-Nazi. They compared, for instance, the shutdown of Netanyahu to Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass when the Nazis went wild in the streets of Germany. Anyway, so just to wrap it up, these events are all come in a row and build on each other. Without what happened in 2001 or what happened in 2002, these demonstrations in 2003 would not have been successful.
All right, well, that's some tremendously interesting context, Laith. Thanks for that. I want to ask, when you finished your degree, how did you survive financially until you became the executive director at CUTV, that is Concordia University Television?
I worked on and off, in different jobs. I did voice acting at one point for video games. People may, when they put my name, sometimes they see it at IMBD, some of the video games that I did. It was not an easy life, to be so vocal about Palestine and be confrontational with the Canadian state. Does not leave much options in the media landscape, to get jobs. So I was doing some production assistant work on projects, and I was doing voice acting. And still, I was also producing radio. At that point, I had already started volunteering at the CKUT in McGill University, and I started a Palestinian show. It was the first Palestinian show in Eastern Canada, and it was called Under the Olive Tree. So that's me, you know, how I started my work in media, trying to figure out what are the limits, what can we do to change the reality of the bias that we see in media in Canada, not only about Palestine, but in general. And that experiment of, you know, volunteering at CKUT, and then having the show expanded to be aired as syndicated on multiple stations, and then getting into the mechanisms of running a radio station, the management, so forth. And eventually, I got elected to be the equity officer of the National Community Radio Association. So this is the umbrella organization that represents all the community radio in Canada in the English sector. And, you know, so it was my attempt to figure out how can we change this reality. And I can tell you from this experiment in the community radio sector, it was clear by the end of it, by the time I reached this point of becoming the equity officer of the National Community Campus Radio Association, it was, you know, eye-opening. Most people, let's say, listen to community radio or volunteer to it, but they don't understand how things work and how policies and or national agendas affect what they're hearing. Ultimately, I can tell you right now, after being in the community radio sector in Canada, we did a study a few years ago on all these campus and community radio stations. There's around 300 somewhat campus community radio stations licensed in Canada. There is maybe 4 non-white staff in the whole sector. So, you know, and much of the staff that is in the community radio sector is people that have been there for 30 somewhat years. So there's, you know, the community radio sector is useless right now because on the one hand, it is objectively more racist and more white than the corporate and or government sectors of radio. And also because you have individuals that are there that have easy salaries, that have no interest in changing, you know, the realities or doing anything innovative. So you have individuals in the sector that control these stations, these staff, that just want to be paper pushers. There's a cycle of production that is there. They don't even need to look for advertisement. They don't need to do anything. Everybody comes to them. They just sit down in their office and collect money. And as we were trying to work in the community radio sector to, you know, not only on Palestine, but to also create news content, because right now there's not one station in the community radio sector in Canada that produces a daily or weekly news hour. And once we tried to do that, all these staffers and agents of the state within the sector worked really hard against that. And in fact, there's a woman right now in the National Community Radio Association who has appointed herself as their legal counsel and appointed herself for life. This happened, you know, now 10 years ago, and she's a Zionist public prosecutor in British Columbia that specializes in criminalizing Indigenous people. And she had appointed herself to become the legal advisor of the National Community Radio Association for life, and with no ability of an elected board to remove her from her position. And she worked really hard to destroy the large community radio stations in the major urban centers. because those were actually where racialized communities were gathering in these large urban centers, and these stations becoming a headache to both the Zionists and the Canadian government. So she managed to basically destroy a CHRY in York University and the Ryerson University radio station and the Radio Co-op in Vancouver. All of them were some of the most important stations in Canada in terms of programming for racialized communities and radical programming. And now those stations are not even remembered. Most people don't even remember that they ever existed or had any effect.
Certainly, speaking from someone who's at now Toronto Metropolitan University and that formerly was Ryerson, yeah, certainly the radio station, when I came in and throughout my years, has been nothing special, frankly, at all. So that's some interesting history, because I certainly wasn't aware of that. All right, so
it was licensed and it was on air, the radio station in Ryerson. What did you call the university now?
Now it's Toronto Metropolitan University.
Okay, so the Toronto Metropolitan University actually had some of the oldest Black community radio shows in Canada. And it was, you know, a center for Black life, basically, in downtown Toronto. And this woman, Freya Zultz, the public prosecutor in British Columbia, she worked to get them delicensed. And that's what happened. They got this delicensed, and they're now just a shadow online station.
All right, so let's jump in now to your time with CUTV. So you come in, you know, you're an opponent of the Canadian state in terms of Zionism, Israeli apartheid. How do you end up getting this executive director role at CUTV despite this?
Yeah, so once I ran through all the community radio sector and from the bottom all the way up and realized the dead end that it is, that's when I tried to switch to figure out how can is there a possibility in television to do something? And so the community television, campus community television sector was my next attempt at making a change. And so there was, openings for jobs at CUTV. They were looking for a station manager. I applied for that job. I was the most qualified person, a person sitting on the hiring committee to stop my hiring told people, hey, what would the Jewish students say if we hire Laith Marouf? And so that I didn't get the job. 6 months later, the woman that got the job, Laura Neal, she's much younger. She doesn't have experience. They just gave her the job because they needed a white person basically in that job. She opened the position of program director, executive director, and I applied for that job and she hired me. So although she wasn't qualified, at least she understood my qualifications and she hired me. And I'm not a person with a huge ego. I have goals and objectives, and I'll work miracles to achieve those goals and objectives. So my goal and objective was to have a huge impact with this TV station, and I worked as good as I can with Laura. So within maybe 9 months, we had launched a funding drive. We raised the budget of the station, and as we are doing this, we realized that there was a possibility of a strike coming up for the students. And given the fact that I was part of the Concordia Student Union years before, involved in the other strikes that happened, and I was a founding member of the SA, which is I don't think it exists anymore. what SA was a umbrella for student unions in Quebec that is progressive, that we helped build to counter the FUC and FAC, the other two umbrella organizations for student unions in Quebec, who were captured by the Bloc Québécois and the Parti Québécois, basically, the nationalists. And so, you know, looking, as I was at CUTV and seeing these general assemblies being held and speaking to different union leaders and seeing that there's something different than any of the other strikes that I was involved in years before, I decided that let's investigate technologies that could help us do live broadcasts from the streets. We looked at the two experiments that existed before us. One was the Arab Autumn experience of Al Jazeera having a live broadcast camera from top of a building looking down at the square. And the other at the option, which was the Occupy Wall Street option of people with their cell phone or carrying a laptop and running around broadcasting with very low quality technically and no journalistic packaging. So we wanted to do something that we can be live from the streets with full technical quality and full journalistic packaging. And we investigated the technologies out there. There was, at the time, only one possible option, this Live View backpack that takes, has 30 pounds backpack that has a computer and 8 SIM cards. You can connect it to a camera and a sound microphone and all of that. And then it takes your video, splits it into 8 streams over the cell network, and then it is put together again in your servers. And you can broadcast it online or on air. So 3 months before the strike, we got the equipment, we experimented with it. This equipment wasn't made for what we wanted to use it for. This equipment was made for somebody standing outside a film festival on the red carpet doing interviews, or somebody standing at the side of the field in an Olympic stadium doing a report or an interview with the athletes. It wasn't meant to be carried around and running for 8 hours at a time, as was happening eventually. So we had to technically reorganize the equipment, add a lot of technical add-ons, batteries, be able to switch the batteries without turning off the camera or the broadcast system. All of this was a lot of training, and the teams were ready. Once the strike was called, then you could see immediately the effects. I don't think anybody was ready for this, neither the Canadian government, the Quebec government, the unions, and or people involved in media in general. And so within 2 weeks, CUTV was garnering around 250,000 simultaneous viewers, unique IP addresses, and on average 2.5 million unique IP visits a day. So those are numbers that are stratospheric, let's say, because you may not know this, but the most watched news hour in Canada, national of CBC, the highest rating it can get is 30,000 viewers. So what we're saying is that CUTV's broadcast from the streets, the studies that were done on influence, they put all the TV stations in Quebec, English and French, all together, and they had less viewership and influence on the story than what CUTV had. So that meant that the government lost control, and the mainstream media lost control of the message, and CUTV dominated the story.
That certainly is quite the achievement, and I don't think we have anything equivalent to a CUTV at that time in this day and age. And I think it's pretty obvious. You can see the damage that comes from a lack of an institution of that sort. So CUTV ends up having quite a successful role in terms of doing its job as student media and effectively bringing attention to this the student protest, assisting in it. Of course, it added to the organizing. But you end up leaving CUTV in 2013, right? You've achieved major budget increases, you've substantial gains in following, you've got more membership. Leadership usually gets rewarded in that kind of situation, but instead you have to leave. Why exactly did this happen?
So as the strike was winding down, immediately I was thinking about how to grow CUTV. You see, even before the strike and this live broadcast, I had reorganized the production cycle. CUTV used to be a student film club, mainly of like 12, 20 somewhat year old boys that are doing fun films for themselves that nobody watches or anything like that. And I reorganized it into an actual TV station. So even before the strike started, we had 8 shows that were coming on a regular basis, on a weekly basis, 8 half-an-hour shows, plus much more. We were funding a lot of other activities, shorts and so forth. And so we already had almost 8 hours of weekly programming before, original weekly programming before the strike starts. The strike starts, we were broadcasting 8+ hours a day. So as this was happening, I was like, okay, let's prepare for the next stage after. The strike is gonna end any time. And so we decided we were going to go and license CUTV to be carried on cable and satellite in Canada. Did an expansion in hiring, doubled the employees from 7 to 14. The new 7 employees were all concentrated on the licensing campaign. And so through this expansion, both in employment and in membership, because we had at that point almost 400 volunteers, and so we have an intake of maybe 300 of those came through those 9 months of the strike. So that meant that we were vulnerable at that moment to infiltration, and that's exactly what happened. The intelligence forces of Canada, allied with the Zionists and the right wing on campus and the liberals on campus, attempted a coup basically at CUTV, and did a takeover at the board of directors of CUTV. It was very sad. And they ended up firing all the staff, withholding my salary for almost 9 months, and I had to go to the labor court, which I won my salary back, but I decided, of course, not to go back. So what they did, this new board, is they deleted all the archive of 800 plus hours of live broadcast that many of the students were using to defend themselves in court, to defend themselves against charges by the police. And the actual archive that is online at the platform that we were using was livestream.com. They closed that channel, and they closed the website. and stopped using the Facebook and Twitter accounts of CUTV, which had tens of thousands of followers, and basically kept the website closed for almost a decade. You couldn't find the website of CUTV. So in this decade of this new board managed to erase the history of CUTV from even memory of much of the population, and that's, I think, what was the aim. It's very sad because, of course, CUTV set an example that hasn't been repeated anywhere since then. It's now 10 years since that day, and I haven't seen a similar example of live broadcasting at that high quality within an agenda of revolutionary work and a TV station. And so it definitely set back all progressive movements in Canada since then.
Yeah, the damage seems very significant, but you didn't stop there, however. I want to shift to discussing a few things. There'll be ICTV, Tele 1, and CMAC. So timeline-wise, ICTV was the first. Let's talk about it. ICTV's origins and really what did it aim to do?
Yeah, so as I said, we were trying to license CUTV before the takeover happened at the board. So the minute that collapsed, I was like, okay, we can't let go of this option of licensing a progressive revolutionary news television station in Montreal. So we looked at the options available to us, and there is the community television sector in Canada. Maybe our listeners don't know about this, but the way it works in Canada is in return for cable companies having the right to use the subterranean, to put their cables. By law, they are obliged to provide a community television station to each distribution zone that they are given. And cable companies, by the way, are monopolies in Canada. So there's no two competing cable companies in the same case. Anyways, this community television station in each zone is supposed to receive 2% of the profits of a cable company. So, for instance, Videotron in Quebec, it's the monopoly cable distributor. They just for the distribution zone of the island of Montreal, 2% of their profit equals $28 million a year. So remember, CUTV's budget was 200 and something thousand dollars, and it took down the government of Quebec and destroyed the monopoly and the control of the story that the media had, the mainstream media. So imagine if you had $23 million a year as a budget, what you can do with it. So once we started looking at MATV, which is the quote-unquote community television station of Videotron, we realized that MATV is in violation of the Broadcasting Act and the policies, the Canadian Radio and Television Commission policies that govern community television. Mainly, a community television is not supposed to be airing professional produced content. Its purpose as a community TV station is to provide the opportunity for communities to train on the skills of television production, and for communities that don't have reflection in the corporate and the government sectors to be able to create programming that reflects their realities. So what we recognized after researching MATV's programming is that basically it's all professional programming. Videotron, the Palido family had hired one of their cousins as the station manager. He doesn't have any skills or knowledge of the sector, just as a slush fund. The policies of community television say that, and the policy of the Broadcasting Act of Canada says that any license should provide equitable employment and reflection and access to the diversity of the Canadian population. So what does this mean? That means that a TV station or radio station in Montreal, where 30% of the population is non-white, their employment should be reflecting that. The programming, when you look at the drama or news programming, if it's always centered around a story with that is white based, how are you providing reflection to, say, the Black, Indigenous, racialized other communities? Similarly, who are the writers, who are the producers, who's the main actors, and what have you? So a look at Videotron, MATV proof that they are in violation. The law and the policy of the community television sector says that if a cable company running a cable station, a community TV station, is found to be in non-compliance with the law and the policies, then a non-profit can take over this license and the funding and provide the service as intended. So we launched a complaint at the CRTC with this very detailed study of all the employment and programming of MATV, and said that the license should be stripped from Videotron, and at the same time we applied for the license. So this, for us, I mean, it just, we thought we're going to win the license, okay? But what it turned out is that the CRTC, although in its ruling, it was the first ever, by the way, ruling that proved that a cable company was abusing the money and not delivering on the objectives of the license of community television license, the CRTC refused to give us the license, okay, and gave Videotron 9 months to correct the problem and come into compliance. 9 months later, we asked for if Videotron came into compliance. The CRTC refused to investigate. So we did a second complaint that not only covered Montreal, but all of Quebec. So all the licenses that Videotron has held. And we deposited this complaint. It was a huge complaint, bigger even than the first one, because it included 9 TV stations. And so the leadership of the CRTC had a total freak out. And so what they did is that as we were getting to the last step of the complaint, all the interventions came from the public, the reply came from Videotron, and the last thing was just for the CRTC to make a ruling, which was going to probably mirror the ruling before, saying all these licenses are in violation of the law and the compliance mechanisms. What the CRTC did is they suspended the process and opened a hearing to rewrite the community television policy. And in this hearing, basically, the CRTC eventually ruled, they rewrote the community television policy, and they legalized the fraud and theft that was already happening. So, Videotron, Rogers, TELUS, Bell were collecting this 2% of their funding that's supposed to go to community television, and then they were not creating a separate corporate entity registered that could have separate accounting books that you could track the money in. They were just creating a virtual station, and all it had was one budget line in the $8 billion budget of Videotron, Quebecor, there's a one line for MATV that says this is how much money and this was how much was spent. And in reality, they were funneling this money to cover the expenses of their corporate stations and the programming in those corporate stations. So Videotron would take the money that's for MATV and spend it on TV productions. So what did the CRTC do? They said, oops, local news programming is very weak across the country. Now it's legal for the cable companies to take that money, the 2% that is supposed to go to community television, and they can spend it on their corporate local news, which was already happening. So they legalized the theft, and then they extracted the segment in the community television policy that said that if a cable company is in violation of the law, that a non-profit can take the license, and said that's not going to happen anymore. That community television is, that cable companies are the stewards of community television forever, basically. And add to that, look at this. So they legalized the theft. They shut down the possibility of a nonprofit holding the license ever, even if and thirdly, they said that these cable companies can take 100% of the budget of the community TV station, spend it on their local news, and they can shut down their community television station, and no one is allowed in that zone after it's shut down to replace that station. So in Toronto, Rogers shut down their community television station, Roger TV, and now there is no community television in the Toronto region, and nobody is allowed to apply for a license even without the money to replace them. Okay? So that's now, we went through the first door, the community radio, we saw where it ended. We went through community television, we saw the destruction of community television because the CRTC and the Canadian government and the intelligence agencies behind also do not want to allow any true platform for racialized communities and Indigenous communities or progressive peoples in Canada that could challenge the mainstream media positions.
All right, so around the time of ICTV, Videotron, and the CRTC ruling, multiple rulings and decisions, there was also the founding of CMAC, and you've been a senior consultant there since 2015. I want to talk about this. It might be a simple question, but I need to ask it. How did it come to exist, and what needed it fill?
Yeah, so the work that I was doing at the National Community Radio Association, the NCRA, and seeing how there is gatekeepers within the community radio sector and eventually the community television sector that make it impossible for us to address the issues of policy and law at the CRTC. There was so many problems at the National Community Radio Association. It's like almost impossible for me to tell you everything, but I can say something. There was at one point even death threats coming to members of the NCRA that were advocating for Palestine and or progressive issues, racialized communities issues. There was, it almost got into fistfights. There was an attempted confinement of one of the executive of the NCRA with threats by Zionists in a room. They were trying to beat her up, basically, a woman. So it was clear that we will not be able to address the rights of racialized and Indigenous communities to media and to reflection and access and employment in these sectors if we work within the NCRA and or Cactus, the equivalent of the NCRA in the community television sector. So all these racialized and indigenous producers that I encountered and worked with and allied with over the decade before that came together and said, let's withdraw from this activity. Our goal is to try to affect the policy and laws and address the CRTC that controls these realities without having to fight people to do so. So let's create an organization specialized in the rights of racialized, indigenous, and disabilities communities to employment and reflection in broadcasting. And let's just do that. And that's what we did. Many of the people that started CMAC were ex-executives at the NCRA, racialized and indigenous, and or ex-station managers and staffers in the community radio sector who tried hard and faced, the music every time they tried to do so. And very fast, it was clear that CMAC is filling a gap in the policy and law scene. We were clearly the only organization. The Community Media Advocacy Center is the only organization on a global scale, not only in Canada, that is specialized in the rights of racialized and indigenous and racial and disability communities to media.
So I want to talk about CMAC a little bit more, and then we're going to get into Tele 1. But before the CMAC really started to get attacked by the Zionists in 2022, what were some of the big achievements that CMAC had? Because it certainly has had staying power.
Yeah, I mean, look, every license renewal, every policy changes that happened since the launching of CMAC, we intervened on those, and we had a huge impact, maybe at least in writing, I would say, because ultimately, look, we were working within a colonial structure, a racialized colonial structure, and we already understood the limits of what we were doing. So what we would do is we would take the international agreements that Canada is signatory to that deal with these issues, whether it's the UNESCO, the Treaty on Cultural Rights, the Guarantee Racialized Communities and Minorities, the right to access and employment in these, or the equivalent treaties in regards to disability communities and indigenous communities and nations, and also the laws that are in Canada and the Broadcasting Act itself, and then we put it in front of the face of the CRTC. The CRTC, for those who don't understand, is a tribunal with the powers of a superior court, so a federal superior court. So it's basically a legal venue. You come in with your arguments, your evidence, your precedents that has, legal record that you're showing that should be followed, and you argue it this way. And if you're actually saying legal things in such way, it's very hard for somebody to maneuver away from your rights, even as in the situation of the CRTC, who are a racist apartheid institution that is empowered really to govern, censor who gets on air in Canada. So very fast, these interventions started having an effect, at least in the decisions of the CRTC in writing. We started getting quoted in the decisions, even though we didn't like much of the decisions that were being made, because the CRTC was still refusing to apply the law. So the Broadcasting Act comes into effect in 1991. It says that licensed broadcasters have to reflect the diversity of the Canadian population in their employment, in their programming, in their access. And not one licensed broadcaster in Canada, whether community, government, or corporate, actually is in compliance of this law since 1991. So we're now, 30 somewhat years later, and that hasn't happened. So it's a useless law in that sense. But finally, after year after year of these confrontations at the CRTC, and your viewers can go to CMAC's website, cmacenter.org, center written the Canadian way with RE. So to see all our interventions. The last intervention we were involved in was the relicensing of CBC. It happens every 7 years, where we demanded access to the employment records and the programming grid of CBC, and the CBC refused under order by the CRTC, who ordered them to release their numbers. And then eventually we had leaked numbers from inside the CBC. Some workers leaked us their numbers, and we put them on the record. And this confrontation at the CRTC around CBC license resulted in the first ruling by the CRTC that orders a licensed broadcaster to comply with the requirement to employ in a reflective way and program in a reflective way. So the decision on CBC that the CRTC did in 2021 said that the CBC has until 2024 to have 30% of their employees as non-white. And you know what happened once that ruling was made? There was 200 appeals made against this ruling to the governor and council, which is the appeal mechanism to the CRTC is either you go to the federal courts of appeal or you send a letter to the governor and council, meaning the cabinet of the prime minister. And Minister of Heritage Rodriguez, who runs the CRTC basically, ordered the CRTC to redo the whole hearing. So for the first time in history, actually the CRTC was going to do its job and give employment and reflection to the racialized and indigenous communities of Canada. And the response was all these white organizations. It's the biggest ever appeal numbers of any decision by the CRTC, 200 appeals. And the minister threw it down the drain, basically. So just because we were gonna get our rights, and this is where the scare that the Zionists have, and the fascists in Canada, the government itself, why it's scared of the work of CMAC. It's because you cannot ignore, if you are claiming that this is a legal system that follows the basics of natural law and justice, then the interventions of CMAC should have a direct impact that gives us our rights, and that's not happening.
So, speaking of the actions of the CRTC, with ICTV, well, of course, the launch of the project that is known as Tele1, which is a national project now. Tele1 had many a run-in with the CRTC. In fact, you were personally in the final decision hearing around a new license that had been stripped from Omni. Now, can you just walk us through this series of events before I ask you overall about the CRTC?
Yeah, so we tried the community radio path, didn't work. Community television, they destroyed it. So we looked at another path, and what was left for us is what the CRTC calls ethnic broadcasting. and that should, in Canada, we have community, corporate, and government television and radio. That's one way of breaking it down. But then we also have English, French, ethnic, and indigenous, or native, as they call it also in the policy. So we have, division according to who owns, and then we have division according to your race, okay, in the licenses. So the indigenous licenses in Canada are non-profit, okay? That includes all the indigenous radio stations, and APTN, the only indigenous television station in Canada, is a non-profit. It has an elected board of directors that is supposed to reflect the indigenous communities and the media organizations within the indigenous communities. When you take a look at the ethnic, quote unquote, television and radio, it is all corporate. There is no such thing as non-profit ethnic radio or television. And the only national ethnic TV station is actually called Omni, and it is owned by Rogers Media. So a corporate entity is kept as a gatekeeper over the voice of the racialized communities in television. And this is, of course, clearly a political decision by the CRTC, because they are scared, more scared than they are this voice, because when we talk about racialized communities, we're talking about almost 30% of the population of Canada. 27, 28% of the population of Canada is neither European or English or French, And so if you have an actual TV station where they have freedom to say what they think they want, they feel, or to reflect their true identity and their true community and so forth, then it is impossible almost to control them. So in 2016, the CRTC found that Omni Television, owned by Rogers, was in violation of its license conditions, was funneling money out, was repurposing programming from its quote-unquote community television station, Roger TV, into Omni, double billing it 3-4 ways, the same program. And so the CRTC yanked the license from Omni Rogers and opened the door for applications like in a competition to replace Omni. Clearly, the political decision that was in the mind of the CRTC and the Canadian government behind them was that they will have all these applications come in from the other cable companies, the other corporations, Bell, Videotron, TELUS, what have you, and that they will compete over who's going to be the gatekeeper over the over the racialized community's voice. And so we decided to disrupt this plan, and we took the core that we had from ICTV, that was to replace Videotron Man TV in Montreal and we expanded it to become a national board of directors, brought in very prominent names from all the different communities that we want to represent, people that have a huge history in media production and or in community organizing and are very respected. And we worked really hard to receive a seed money grant, basically, promise from the Desjardins Fond d'Action. The Desjardins is, for those listeners outside Quebec, is the bank that is owned by the labor unions in Quebec, and it has these funds for development. One of them is the Fond d'Action and Fond Solidaire, and we applied to replace Omni. And so that blew up the mind of the CRTC, the commissioner and the chair of the CRTC were shocked. Of course, that also shocked all the corporate sector of broadcasters. And we had presented the best option that had the backing and approval of practically all the racialized community organizations in Canada. You know, East Asian, South Asian, Arab, African, Caribbean, Latino. Everybody was behind us. We had the money, we had the programming, we had everything. And so the CRTC slept on the decision for almost a year and finally made a decision that is unique in all of the history of the CRTC. You know, when there is a legal case, not only in CRTC, in any court, and the decision is made by the judge. The judge usually says, this side said this, they were wrong on that, this side said that, they're right on this, and I make my judgment because of this. The CRTC, when they make a ruling on a competition for a license, usually they'll be, well, applicant blah, blah, blah had these suggestions, and we thought it wasn't good because of that. And applicant blah, blah, blah had these suggestions which were better, and we approve of that, and that's why we gave them the license. In this ruling, for the first time in the history of the CRTC, not one of the competitors was mentioned in the ruling. It just said Omni had their license suspended, Omni got their license back. No reason given, and no reason to tell you why the others were rejected or what was better in those options. So they were too scared even to mention why they gave back the license and the voice of the racialized communities, why they gave it back to Rogers. I'm sorry, I lost the electricity here for a second. Because they were worried if they do, that will open grounds for appeal in an appeal court. And so here we have the ethnic television path shut down also, and now we're left basically with no option. If your community radio and community television and your ethnic television and radio are all shut down to you, and the corporate sector says they are there to represent their owners, and the government sector says that they are not here to represent you as a racialized person, then you have no representation. Racialized and in indigenous communities in Canada have zero representation that is not filtered or controlled by the government and its agents.
So in terms of this corporatized nature of these ethnic stations now, do you think this serves to suppress the communities, some of these ethnic communities' inherent distaste for elements of Canadian foreign policy?
Yes, of course. Like, think about it this way. If the only way an ethnic community can have a license is to have money, basically, and you have no funding coming from anywhere, it means the only person that can license, let's say, an Arab station or a Black station or a Chinese station in Canada are the financial elite of those communities. And we, of course, know that the financial elite of any community, including the white communities, French or English in Canada, are collaborators with the government and are benefactors of the system of injustice. Okay, so you will turn on, let's say, the radio station that is Chinese, and if you know Mandarin or Cantonese and so forth, and listen to it in Vancouver, you will realize that this radio station is Falun Gong or anti-communist and or repeating anti-Chinese government propaganda. Similarly, when you listen to Arabic radio stations, if you speak Arabic in Montreal and in Ottawa, and you will realize that actually the radio station is populated by Phalange, Christian Arab supremacists, the death squads that slaughtered people in the refugee camps in Lebanon in the 1980s, and or Wahhabis and or Muslim Brotherhood agents that are all basically aligned with the imperialist objectives of the Canadian government. So that is the reality right now. The ethnic radio sector is a disaster for these communities. They can't find the reflection of their own opinion. They can only find a reflection of the Canadian policy, even in their own language. And so it's a really bad situation for most of the racialized communities.
For sure, the situation is quite dire. Overall, I think something that I think a lot of people have had to come to terms with, but even back in 2019, when I was around the time that Canfiles was started up, I could just sense something was off. And at the time, I looked at it and I thought it was more banal, rather, in terms of our imperialism session. Obviously, that was a view that evolved, and I realized I was wrong. But the thing that strikes me the most is that it's not that what's going on here is banal. It's that the repression it's really systematic and bureaucratic. It's actually in some sense it's scarily effective. That's the thing that I think people need to keep in mind. Really, is that there is a flat out repression of dissident voices, especially from all around, especially ethnic communities, the left generally, and so forth. And that comes through bureaucracy rather than, say, flat out violence at this point. But people need to keep that in mind, because we're not a banal nation. We're a nation that our government really relies on bureaucratic suppression at the end of the day. I want to get back to CMAC though. So you have CMAC, of course, you get the contract with Canadian Heritage, and of course Canadian Heritage, as I watched through your interviews, and you talked to Yuri. I mentioned Yuri because he's a good friend of the Canfiles. You talked to him all about how Canadian Heritage really needed you folks at CMAC to do that grant. You had 4 days to apply. You got in very quickly. They wanted your work, right? It's to host a series of anti-racism conferences across the country, and this was I believe, if I'm correct, this is fairly soon after the death of George Floyd, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So what I want to jump to is the attacks on CMAC. Talk to me essentially about who really sought to attack you, spear you, and the consequences for yourself, your family, and CMAC.
Yeah. So obviously, our work at CRTC was triggering a lot of the Zionists within the media sector that were watching our interventions. As I said, at least our interventions had a lot of effect in the legal sphere. They publish every year the books for lawyers. When you walk into a lawyer's office, all these legal references. There's legal references for broadcasting and communication laws in Canada, and CMAC's interventions are mentioned, each and every one of them almost, in these, because they set the tone. It's one of a kind. There's no everybody else that intervenes at the CRTC are suck asses, if I'm sorry to use the bad language, but they're they don't do confrontational rights strategies that we do. Okay, so some of these Zionists start getting also scared because they saw what we did with Tele One. They also saw the how we proved all these cable companies were stealing the money. And so one of these Zionists, his name is Mark Goldberg. He is a person that I have no idea how they got involved in the sector, but he runs an annual communication summit where all the CEOs and so forth of cable and communication companies come together, and the CRTC goes, the commissioners and so forth. he starts tweeting, attacking CMAC for its work, and part of it was because in the hearing for CBC, we mentioned how CBC banned the use of the word Palestine on air. In fact, it was because there was an indigenous broadcaster who had a show on CBC radio. He had invited Joe Sacco, the very famous graphic novelist, and because Joe Sacco was doing research for his latest book that was gonna cover the Dene people's struggle in Northwest Territories and the Yukon. And in the interview, this indigenous radio host brings up the seminal work of Joe Sacco, Palestine. And so the Zionists complained that he used the word Palestine, which is the name of the book, plus the name of the land. And they managed to get, by 24 hours later, the host on air had to apologize for using the word Palestine on CBC radio. And they pulled the original piece from the Internet Archive and clipped out the word Palestine. So in this same interview, both the interviewer and Joe Sacco were talking about Denende, the land of the Dene people is called Denende. And so CBC, in their ruling of why they banned the use of Palestine and took out this, they claim that there is no such thing as a state called Palestine. But it didn't matter that there is no such thing as a state called Denende, right? So we brought this up in the CBC hearing, and that freaked out Mark Goldberg, and he tweeted, "There's no such thing as Palestine," and all of these things, and started attacking me, and got my first account banned at Twitter, complaining about my tweets. That was 2 years ago, and then he continued somehow hammering, and eventually got the backing of these MPs. Just before we continue about that, I want to say that CMAC in the Community Media Advocacy Center in 2018 had held regional and national conferences across Canada to bring together Indigenous broadcasters, media producers, media workers, and academics to envision a better future for Indigenous broadcasting in Canada. And the Minister of Heritage at the time came. The chair of the CRTC had a fight with us and the other Indigenous broadcasters that were involved in this. But it set the tone that forced the CRTC to open up a process to rewrite what they call a native broadcasting policy. And so we took that same model when we were approached by the Canadian Heritage after the slaughter of in the United States and the Black Lives Matter and the pulling out of the dead children from mass graves, Indigenous children in mass graves in Canada. That's when we were approached by this Canadian Heritage to do a similar thing of bringing together racialized broadcasters, academics, organizations across in regional areas and in a national event to envision what they think should be a way to better their situation in the broadcasting sector and to end racism in the broadcasting sectors. So it's very similar to the work that we did for Indigenous people. And so we started that work, and within, by the third event, that's when the attacks started piling up, and Zionist members of Congress backed Mark Goldberg and started attacking the Ministry of Heritage and Minister of Multiculturalism, and to basically defund CMAC.
All right, so now I want to ask about the support, really, or the lack thereof, that you received from Canadian anti-imperialist and Palestine focus groups in the wake of targeting? Do you think there was enough support, or do you think it was frankly lacking?
Well, clearly, we're not living the heydays of 2002 and even or 2012. The left is much weaker today than even 20 years ago or 10 years ago. And similarly, the Palestinian solidarity sphere in Canada has been weakened drastically. Part of that is because of how the Jewish anti-Zionists have created their own organizations, and which now have created careers and money funneling into that, drying up the money that used to come to the Palestinian communities, and or taking more space as Jewish anti-Zionist people than any Palestinian can take in the spaces in media and or organizing. And of course, there's been multiple actions by intelligence agencies like MK, Ultra, like in the 1970s and 60s, of destroying and creating interfighting and so forth. So I personally was not, all my work, at least in the media sector, I have not depended on anybody, and I still don't depend on anybody except my own work. It would be lovely to see people come to my defense, but I'm not feeling bad that they're not coming to my defense. I can understand how Palestinian or Arab or Muslim organizers would be scared. What they just did, the Zionists and the Zionist media in Canada and the Zionist government, what they did to me is unprecedented. I mean, even in Netanyahu's days, when we shut down Netanyahu in 2012, that's right, in 2002, there was not this much media coverage to destroy the livelihood and the careers and the names of those who were involved. We're talking about right now 3,000 articles, media, radio, television segments that were produced about my case in 9 months, something like 3 million tweets. I mean, these are ridiculous numbers. So, would I wish that the pro-Palestine organizers and or the progressive anti-imperialist circles have the guts and the courage to even do 1% of what I did or confront the state in any way? Yes. But it's not happening now, and we'll have to continue this struggle without thinking, just like the Palestinians on the ground. They don't have backing internationally. We'd wish that there's backing internationally, but you have no choice but to resist.
No doubt. Resistance to imperialism and colonialism is certainly, it's mandatory if you want to see a better world. So one of the things that struck me is in terms of the really the obsessive focus on making sure that you couldn't be on social media in any sort of way, shape, or form. So there's this U.S.-Canada Joint Committee, the Inter-Parliamentary Task Force to Combat Online Anti-Semitism. This was in September 2022, right? They met in Washington. Twitter CEO appeared in front of them. What was your reaction to their really obsessive focus on you?
I mean, I was shocked. I really thought that it couldn't get worse than 2001 or 2000, in terms of their obsession with me. But then again, after, I calmed down and I started thinking about it. Look, Irwin Cutler was our prime enemy in Canada in 2002. He, because of 2002, pushed forward in the Canadian Parliament the hate speech laws that exist in Canada, which got ratified basically in 2004, 2005, brought into the criminal code. And so Aaron Cutler wrote the hate speech laws in Canada, criminalizing anybody that advocates hate, and he wanted to basically use it against the Palestinian organizers in Canada because of what we did in 2002 with Netanyahu. But since that day, he wasn't able to charge anybody under this hate speech laws. Why? Because you can't say that somebody is hateful to Jews. It will lose in court if you claim that Laith Marouf is anti-Jewish because he's critical of Zionism and the state of Israel and Jewish white supremacy. You will lose that in court. So here we have laws that are brought into by Aaron Cutler. Now he realized they don't work. So once he realized they don't work, they started pushing the definition of the new anti-Semitism and the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and Aaron Cutler was part of that, pushed to make it that criticism of Zionism and or the state of Israel makes you anti-Jewish to be labeled. Now, of course, even then, Aaron Cutler himself knows that he can't make that as part of the law. Anywhere, not only in Canada, if they attempt to put the IHRA definition into the Criminal Code of Canada, it will be challenged and lose in court, 100%. This is why they didn't charge anybody prior to the IHRA definition of hate speech when they're criticizing Zionism in Israel, nor now. So what do they do now? What did they do? They wanted to push the IHRA within the government agencies as policies, not as laws. So they can cut the funding to people and purge any workers within the bureaucracy of Canada that are critical of the state of Israel without having to charge anybody criminally because they know they will lose it. So right now, B'nai B'rith for the last 3-4 months has been calling on the Canadian government to charge Laith Marouf with hate speech. I say, please. And I know why I haven't been charged, because they know they will lose it. In fact, the Prime Minister of Canada is a coward. Justin Trudeau is a coward. I challenged him on the first week to charge me with hate speech. I want my day in court. But what they did instead is they ran a trial in absentia at the Canadian Congress, Parliament, in the Heritage Committee, 6 times meeting now, speaking about me in absentia. Okay? So trial in absentia at the Canadian Heritage Committee. Trial by media, where media coast to coast in Canada, English and French, repeating libel and slander as if it's fact, without ever being charged with any crime or being found guilty of anything. Now, according to the Canadian media and the Canadian Parliament, I am anti-Jewish. I'm also anti-Black because I said Colin Powell, the war criminal who justified the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, covered it up. The war criminal who led to the death of 1.5 million Iraqis because of his lie at the Security Council about chemical weapons in Iraq. Criticizing him makes me anti-Black, apparently. Okay, criticizing a collaborator, indigenous woman that collaborates with the Canadian government on the colonization of her own people. This woman whose family is accused of stealing all the historical artifacts of the Algonquin people, and me working for 20 years volunteering in indigenous communities with zero media coverage, zero work in public, because I know it's my duty as a person who lives in Canada to do this work. I become anti-indigenous according to the Canadian government and the media, who was the Canadian media, who is denying the existence of mass graves of indigenous children. I become anti-indigenous because I criticize an indigenous collaborator. And finally, you know, so what does this mean? What does this mean? What does this tell you? You know, the media in Canada, the mass media in Canada is unreformable. There is no legal path for racialized and indigenous people to change the colonial reality in the media in Canada, in the broadcasting media in Canada. And the Canadian government will ostracize and will criminalize anyone who tries to challenge this apartheid on the airwaves that exists in Canada. I think the worst part of all of these things, you know, for me, was when the Heritage Committee invited the chair of the CRTC, outgoing chair of the CRTC. And remember, the CRTC, as I said, is a legal entity. It's a tribunal with the power of a superior court. When the chair said that he will find ways to bar Laith Marouf and or bar CMAC, the Community Media Advocacy Center, for participating at the CRTC on grounds of my speech outside the CRTC, speech that is covered, you know, protected under the law, that I haven't been charged criminally for. So what does this mean? This means that imagine a lawyer like Giuliani, Donald Trump's lawyer. Most people hate him. But imagine this Giuliani walks into a court, puts evidence on the table in front of the judge, and motions. And the judge refuses to look at their evidence and motions of Giuliani and says, "Get the hell out of my court. I don't like how you spoke in your press conference about Trump, not about this case, not your behavior inside my court, not your evidence or illegal motions. I will ban you from court because of speech outside my court." This is what the CRTC right now did. They have banned CMAC as an organization, not on grounds of their interventions being frivolous or their evidence being fake, not even about their behavior inside the CRTC court, but because of Laith Marouf's speech on what? On Twitter. This is, what is this? It means that the Canadian government and the Zionists in Canada have decided to strip all Canadians of their right to legal representation at the highest governing body that controls all media in Canada. Just to stop who? To stop Laith Marouf, to stop CMAC, to stop Palestine. And all the Canadians, media activists, blah, 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 leftist, anti-imperialist, decolonialists, quiet. They just lost all their rights. Now one of them gets up to complain that they lost the right to intervene at the highest governing body controlling media in Canada.
And I want to speak to another element of consequences of the attacks you faced, and the fact that they're basically unopposed by anyone by yourself and some close allies and other media. Is on February 13th, right? You have independent Jewish voices tweeting out about fact that Canadian Heritage grant applicants will be now required to promise to, quote, not undermine Canada's anti-racism strategy, end quote, which includes the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, and that definition is also being integrated into the vetting process for grant applicants. Back on that Your Smoother 1+1 interview in October of last year, you had already spoke about Canadian Heritage being pressured into pausing funding and reviewing all grantees' social media for criticism of Israel after CMAC became smeared and attacked, and how Zionists want to connect the ability to get funding with the acceptance of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. So with this warnings that you're making in October, it almost seems like those ended up effectively coming into fruition. Do you effectively see really a line between the attacks on CMAC and then the ability of the Canadian state to feel confident in launching these attacks on really the Palestinians and anyone that supports them via this IHRA definition being implemented?
Yeah, definitely. Look, although of course the Zionists have a vendetta against me, and that drives some of this activities, they also have a goal, and to use and abuse this situation to achieve much more than just banning Laith Marouf or cutting my livelihood. And it was clear from how weak the response was by pro-Palestine groups, including the Independent Jewish Voices, at the outset of this attack, and how no media activists, even whatever their stripes are, came out to stand against what the Canadian government is doing. It was clear that the Zionists are going to have an easy path forward to demolishing any independence that exists within the bureaucracy of Canadian Heritage Ministry, and to bring into heel the CRTC, who up until that point were letting CMAC participate and present evidence. So, I'm also shocked that not one organization that already had a contract with Heritage haven't appealed at a court this decision. So imagine you've already signed a contract, you have your money, and suddenly it's suspended, and you're told that there will be an investigation, a complete investigation of all of your workers, your contractors, your board members, all of their social media accounts, for any offending speech that is critical of Israel. And imagine that nobody complained. I mean, this is a breach of the charter, basic charter rights. Okay, it's not something that anybody. You are not supposed to be vetted for your political beliefs before receiving funding or government grants or contracts. That's actually one of the basic breaches of charter rights. So not one organization complained. And then they all were forced to sign a pledge of allegiance, basically, to the Jewish supremacist colony in Palestine. They had to basically pledge that they will not criticize and they will abide by the IHRA poisonous definition of anti-Jewish behavior. So it's done. If nobody complained, nobody took it to court, nobody did anything, it's done. It's a fact. It's de facto now. You cannot receive money from the government right now if you're critical of the state of Israel, and nobody fought it.
Right, and I think the important thing is for anyone who, I'd be shocked if people weren't aware of the IHRA definition, right? But explain to people just quickly how the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, right, is very toxic.
Because it has these sections that speak about, how criticism of the state of Israel or its actions or Zionism are basically anti-Semitic. I hate using the word anti-Semitic because I'm a Semite, and Jewish white people are definitely not Semites. But yes, criticism of the state of Israel, they consider it to be anti-Jewish. This is ultimately what the Zionists want to do. They want to equate between Judaism and a religion that is, that has multi-race, multi-groups in it, and then political ideology of Zionism that advocates Jewish supremacy and colonialism in Palestine. It's like saying Wahhabism is Islam, and if you criticize the Saudis or the Wahhabi death squads, the ISIS and Al-Qaeda, then you're anti-Muslim. Or to say that Nazism and Christianity are the same, and if you criticize the Nazis in Ukraine or the Nazis in Germany in the 1930s, then you're anti-Christian. That's what they're trying to do, and it seems like they have achieved that within the Western government, not as a legal thing. As I'm telling you now, there's no way, even though it's colonial courts in Canada, if the IHRA definition goes to court, it will lose. If they try to attempt to charge somebody with hate speech like myself under that, they will lose. Even under the hate crimes laws of Canada that are prior to the IHRA, they will lose because there's nothing illegal or wrong or hateful to criticize a state or political ideology.
Sure. So one quick point I want to jump and say, because the connection cut a little bit, was in terms of your point of the comparisons, right? For example, how ludicrous it is to say that, say, criticizing Wahhabism is then attack on Islam, and about how basically the idea of criticizing that is almost equivalent to saying that criticizing, say, Nazis in Ukraine or Nazi Germany is equivalent to criticizing or attacking Christianity. That's the ludicrous part, right? I just want to clarify that fully.
Yes.
Okay, great. Just want to clarify that. So I want to jump now into the Palestine Solidarity Movement. What is your thought on the state of Canadian Palestine solidarity and the groups there? I mean, when I see it, I don't see a word of support, let's say, for the armed resistance in Palestine, right? There's no acknowledgement of who supports the armed resistance in Palestine. I'm just wondering your thoughts on the Palestine Solidarity Movement in Canada.
Well, it is in a very weak state in comparison to 20 years. I kind of alluded to it a little bit earlier. There was much intelligence work done by the CSIS and so forth to create factionalism. From that stage, there was much more problems with the creation of a separate Jewish anti-Zionist organizations that are now filled with careerists and are sucking away the funding, the viewership, the media coverage that the Palestinians as a community are doing in Canada. So definitely I'm not happy about the state Palestinian solidarity in comparison to 20 years. But I would say the most disappointing part of all of this is definitely groups like Independent Jewish Voices. Here you have a group that was supposedly started to, challenge the idea that Zionism or Israel represents all the Jewish people. And they have a privilege, it's all Jewish white people, Canadians, that have the privilege to, take a risk and not end up in Guantanamo. Much of what we did in 2001, 2002, as Palestinians, as Arabs, as Muslims, put us at a very high risk, not only of losing our careers or education or or never having a job again, but actually being renditioned. Okay, those risky activities that we were doing, those radical risky activities that we were doing as Arabs, as Palestinians, that's the least that Jewish Canadians should be doing. But what we see right now is that these anti-Zionist Jewish Canadians, like the IJV, is that they're doing the basic safe things, like organizing events, lectures, hosting rallies. Well, those should be actually left for the Palestinian and Arab and Muslim youth, because they're safe, activities that they could do without going to jail for or being renditioned. And radical activities should be taken over by these Jewish Canadians, the anti-Zionist Jewish Canadians, like occupying the Israeli embassy, like taking over synagogues that are Zionist and putting somebody on the pulpit that is anti-Zionist Jew, like shutting down the Israeli lobby groups, occupying them, like going to the offices of these fascist Jewish supremacist MPs like Housefather and occupying them. Those are activities that IGV should be doing. But unfortunately, in my mind, after looking at this over a decade of activities of IGV, I feel that these quote-unquote anti-Zionist Jews in Canada are also as culpable for the crimes of Zionism as their Zionist fellows, because none of them are willing to risk their livelihood, let alone their life, to stop the oppression of the Palestinian people, even in Canada, that is being conducted by their compatriots, Jewish Zionist Canadians, that are destroying my livelihood and my career. That's what they should be doing as Jewish Canadians. And so I think I put a big part of the blame of our problems today on organizations like IJV, not because, of course, there's not blame to go around for everybody, but their weakness and their insistence on taking the weakest position and the easiest things to do is basically, they cut off Palestinian students from being able to organize events on campus and raise funds, because now IGV comes there. And white Canadians have a tendency to like to listen to a Jew before they like to listen to a Palestinian. This is simple realities. Maybe if they hear me today, members of IJV, they can understand that the least they should be doing is what Palestine Action in the United Kingdom is doing, which is occupying factories of weapon manufacturers, destroying the machineries, and going to court for it and winning. IJV should be doing at least that. They should be occupying the weapons manufacturers that are sending weapons to Israel from Canada. That's the least of it.
All right. So in terms of the price paid, by Palestinians to engage in more radical action, my eyes came upon recently a Globe and Mail article which was released on the 13th, talking about how you had nearly been blocked and kept out of Canada and actually interviewed by CSIS in 2009. So that's the kind of risk, that people that are willing to engage in radical action, especially Palestinian folks, Arab folks who oppose Israeli apartheid, will face. So when there's this careerism, people wonder, why there isn't change. I mean, there's the choice between protecting privilege and actually challenging power. And essentially it's a question of if you want to have dignity or if you want to have, some financial stability, but nothing changes, right? So I just want to bring that up as further context to what you spoke to, because like I said, Palestinians, Arabs, they pay a price for opposing that, and certainly I know, for example, like if I'm a white Canadian, obviously I know I'm a settler, as well as all Canadians are on here, other than Indigenous folks. But if I was Arab, if I was Palestinian, any sort of Muslim, I know that I would face a lot more attacks. I'm well aware of the fact that, because I'm white at the end of the day, I face less attacks, and I think that has been part of what's pushed me to be willing to stick my neck out, is because, well, I have the privilege at the end of the day, right? And you got to use that, because other folks just don't, right? That's the sad reality of the whole state of affairs with politics in colonial nations and colonial and imperial nations. So I want to look towards the future now. In terms of the future for ICTV, Tele One, and CMAC, what's your feeling on these organizations' futures?
Well, Tele One, ICTV, we are trying right now to figure a different path to launch this TV station. Hopefully in the next 6 to 9 months, we'll have some good news for everybody. But that's where we're going. We have to continue. There is no future for any of us in the progressive circles without a mass media platform that could compete with the tsunami of constant propaganda that's coming out of the mainstream media. And it's clear, of course, from this experiment that even social media is actually a very controlled space, and so we have to go back to the basics and launch a TV station. So that's hopefully in the next 6 to 9 months you'll have some good news for you.
Would that likely be just to jump in? Would that likely be a national or more Quebec/Montreal focused?
No, it will be actually an international, English-speaking, international English-speaking news TV station that's based in Canada, but it will be, trying to fill that same gap in all the Anglo sphere.
Certainly.
In terms of CMAC, right now, we are waiting to see how the government will attempt to collect the money back in violation of the basics of contract law, and so we're still waiting for the government to take us to court, basically, if they have the courage, which they will lose. I tell the Zionists from today, even if you take me for 10 years all the way to the Supreme Court, I will pay for it from my own pocket. Okay, not CMAC. CMAC as an organization will continue existing, and this attempt to financially destroy CMAC will not have a result, and they will lose in court. They know already. The weakest, newest lawyer looking at the contracts and what the government was trying to do right now knows that they will lose in court. And the Canadian government will have to appeal all the way to the Supreme Court just to keep us distracted and to keep their Zionist bedfellows appeased. But that will happen. The other thing about CMAC is that right now we have a bigger challenge, which is the issue of the CRTC deciding that it wants to ban. We haven't received anything written saying that we are banned from participating at the CRTC. But we will be finding ways to discover how is this happening and what the CRTC can do. And if they actually ban us from participation, then we will be taking the CRTC itself to court for breaches of charter rights, given that the stupid outgoing chair of the CRTC in the Canadian Heritage Committee said openly that they are looking, he says, how can I say this without looking like I'm trying to ban my critics? but we're trying to find ways to block them from participating. So according to the CRTC chair himself, we are critics of the CRTC. And according to the chair of the CRTC himself, they were trying to manipulate the law to find ways to block us. So that's a challenge we will continue also. And so that's in the short, future of next 9 months.
Certainly, as I was making the point, certainly a television station of that nature would be a very progressive step, and people always have to think about, it's nice to have individual voices, but institutions challenge colonialism, challenge power, because individuals burn out. So having an institution like that, like I said, many people will be keeping a close eye on that. And certainly, it'll be interesting to see how the CRTC attempts to react to that, given their past behavior. No doubt there'll be a fight there, but at least waging that war is a must. And if that TV station can win out, well, like I said, major step forward. Enough on the monologue, though. I just want to ask really one last question. In terms of Lebanon now, you live in Lebanon. What do you do day to day for work?
Well, I am a consultant for media broadcasting and organizing and laws. I do consult media organizations and television stations around the world, not only, so I don't only work for CMAC, so I get contracts, for instance, reorganizing the production cycle of certain news departments and stations. The multimedia angle part of media production that everybody is now involved in, that's also some of the work that I contract on. And I do a lot of media interviews almost on a daily basis, but of course that is not remunerated financially. So I'm keeping myself busy. There's not much funding coming from all the work in Canada because of this Zionist attack, but hopefully that will also end. Look, none of the work that I did in this media struggle was ever very much covered costs. At the time I was working at CUTV as the executive director, my salary was $14 an hour. Okay. This work at the CRTC, it's, hundreds of hours of work, months at a time, hearings and contracts. And it was a good pay, but given the amount of work that was and the clear attacks that result of it, you can understand my intention was never about the issue of money. I could have made tons more money if I kept my mouth shut, because there is very little of the kind of expertise that I have in terms of having this whole overall picture of the production cycle from bottom up in radio and television sectors, in the community, corporate, and government sector, and also knowing the laws and broadcasting laws, not only in Canada, but across the world. I consulted the Mexican government, for instance, writing their indigenous broadcasting laws. We consulted the South African government, trying to write their community television and community radio laws. So this is a specialty of, that is not available in much of the world. And I know that no matter what the Zionists try to do, they can't end my life or career.
Well, certainly seems like you aren't planning to stop fighting, and that's a good sign. We need more fighters, especially those in Canada and those connected to it. So now I want to really end off this interview by giving you a chance to plug yourself. Where can people check out your work? And obviously you're banned on social media, but where can people check you out, keep an eye on what you do?
Well, I have a website, laithmarouf.com, and it's written like the same spelling as my name. You can donate there to our legal funding for CMAC and myself for the defense of our activities. And I am not updating it that often, but I should be updating more often soon. And I hope it will be having also more original content coming out of on the website in the very near future. We're working on something right now.
All right. So, to Canadophile's viewers, I want to speak to you about the importance of institutions. As Laith mentioned, as I mentioned as well, institutions is what builds the struggle, and we really direly lack media. That's where the Canadophiles comes in. Since 2019, we've been doing our extensive work, investigations, analysis of Canadian foreign policy. We've started the Speaker Series. We've been able to interview Ava Bartlett. We've been able to interview Dimitri Lascaris, and now a third terrific guest, Laith Marouf. This kind of journalism, though, it costs money, and it takes a lot of time. We've gone up to over $1,400 a month in support, and to the existing supporters, we can't thank you enough. But we need new supporters, right, to jump in, join the battle, bring in monthly or annual support, and help us do our work. Because without institutions, we can't challenge power, we can't challenge imperialism, and we can't challenge colonialism. So, thank you everyone for watching. You can set up a donation if you wish to the Canadophiles. Link will be in the description. And yeah, thank you so much everyone for getting all the way through this interview. Hope you folks have enjoyed it. It's really been a very interesting one, even intriguing, and an opportunity to learn even for myself. That's it, folks. Thank you very much for watching this interview, and have a terrific day.